about LNG Canada there. Let's bring in our front bench, former BC Premier Christy Clark. She's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones and the host of the Christy Clark Show. Randy Boissonnault, former Liberal cabinet minister, currently a Canadian trade advisor, joins us, and CTV political analyst and former Conservative industry minister James Moore is here. He's now a senior advisor at Edelman. And former Alberta Premier Alison Redford. She's now a principal at the Redford Group. I want to begin with our Albertans, including Ms. Redford, because we're going to be talking about separation. We're going to be talking about, of course, LNG and all of the mega projects. Ms. Redford, can you bring us to Alberta? And for a lot of people, they don't really understand why a premier who's a federalist continues to seem to be encouraging or at least allowing this kind of petition or referendum to go on in the face of various obstacles that I would argue other premiers would say, okay, we've got to stand down because the courts say so. Do you have a sense of what's going on there politically and also perhaps legally?
Well, I think politically and legally, they're very different questions. The decision yesterday was a legal decision that led to a political consequence. In terms of the Premier's view, as I understand it, she believes that it's important to allow Albertans to express those opinions. And one of the reasons that she wants to put this question on the ballot in the fall is so that Albertans will have an opportunity to express their view. Now, some premiers may take a different view and say that it's important to advance a perspective that they were elected on to support and to continue to develop. I know that this is a premier who believes in people having the right to express their opinion, and she obviously is trying to allow them to do that. I do think it is legally interesting that the decision that was made was based on legislation that her government passed, and they have found the approach to handling that legislation to be unconstitutional. The judicial process is very different than the political process, and I think that it's important for us to respect that process going forward, because then we can have confidence in the result. But I think politically, for the Premier, she thinks that there's a lot of people in her party who want to have the opportunity to express an opinion and is trying to give them that opinion or that opportunity to.
And we just had Randy Boissonnault, we just had Corey Hogan on, who suggests that, you know, that this sentiment has always been there in Alberta. And I mentioned the National Energy Program. He said, no, go further. The founding of the province, 1905. Do you agree with that, or is there something different happening here?
So, Graham, thanks for that. You can trace the roots of the separatist movement back to a reaction to the National Energy Program. Certainly, there's the Western Canada concept, and I'm old enough to remember Doug Christie winning an election in the 80s on that piece, and it has ebbed and flowed with time. And look, I was an Alberta cabinet minister, the Alberta cabinet minister in the second part of the Justin Trudeau government, and it was my job every day to make sure that we would bridge those gaps. We got a pipeline built, an expansion, doubling the size of TMX to the coast. But it's a sentiment that has been there. What's happening now, though, is something that's fueled by sources outside of our country. It's amplified by misinformation. It's amplified by social media. And I really appreciate former Premier Redford's comments about the legal result yesterday becoming a political challenge. And I really think now is an important decision point for Premier Smith. You cannot sit down with the feds and negotiate a new deal that will make Albertans more prosperous and Canada stronger on a Monday, and then put a referendum question on the ballot on Friday. You simply can't do that. The Premier needs to pick a lane. And I think what Albertans need to see, and what Canadians are waiting to see, is does the Premier choose to fight a threat to her party from the inside, or does she choose to fight a threat to the country?
All fair points, James. I also heard the Premier very clearly say that she's consulting cabinet and caucus, and this is I think underscoring the point that many people believe courts are overstepping and government should make this decision. What about that in this case? Does she have options? Because she seems to suggest she does.
Yeah, she has options. There's still an opportunity to have a referendum, and she could put forward a different question if she wants to. It's fraught with risk, obviously, right? She has options to stand down, which is what Randy's proposing here. But if she were to do that, then the 300,000 Albertans who signed this petition, I think, would turn around, and a good chunk of them would probably mobilize and would perhaps threaten or flat out jeopardize and end her leadership of the UCP. And the UCP party would have to have a massive decision to make about who her successor would be, which would be an open separatist or an open federalist, and then that warfare would happen within the governing party, the incumbent governing party of the province of Alberta. Hugely problematic. Albertans, certainly when I was in government, when Randy was in government, and others, Albertans rightly complained that Alberta was being stymied by the dynamic of Canada because there was all of this uncertainty that was happening in British Columbia, all this uncertainty that was happening in Ottawa on the regulatory side, on the taxation side, all this uncertainty that was happening on the trade side. Now all the uncertainty is being chosen deliberately by Premier Smith. And she needs to find her way out of this. There's a saying, you dance with the one that brung you. Well, the one that brung Danielle Smith to the leadership of the UCP party, it now seems to be commanding her directions on this. This is a political problem for her and her continued leadership of the party that she crafted by bringing people into the party that are now commanding, I think, too much authority within that party. But her political problem should not be a national unity problem. It should not be an economic crisis for everyday Albertans and their ability to get their projects approved and moving to global markets.
Well,
she's created a problem for herself, and it's problematic.
Yeah. The other issue here is that there was a decision made by a court in Alberta yesterday that said that there were certain actions that weren't constitutional. And although the Premier might think that she has some political options, I do think it's important, especially in a debate about separation and federalism, that we respect constitutional institutions. So I agree with James and with Randy that she has a certain number of options, but her main option, if she wants to proceed with this, is to appeal this decision. You can't ignore the courts, and you can't ignore the duty to consult. And those are very important right now in this debate in Alberta.
And I don't like cutting people off when the discussion is spirited, but Christy Clark, I want to get you in here on a blunt BC assessment. Did she open up a can of worms, and now she's got to deal with it?
I mean, look, James is totally right. You go out there, you start playing footsie with the lunatics, you are going to have a problem in the long term. It's never a good plan. And so, she's baked this cake. I guess she's going to have to eat it. I think, though, there's a couple of things that I would add to the comments that have been made, and I agree with all of them. One of them is decisions like this from the court, particularly after the Cowichan decision in British Columbia, which calls into question people's rights to private property and have got people really worked up and concerned. Decisions like this that take away people's right to be able to put a referendum question on, no matter how kooky and crazy it is, are pretty fundamentally questioning democracy. So I think this is going to be one of those things where people, they may completely disagree with it, as I do, I don't think the question should be there at all. But for the courts to intervene and decide that people's democratic will not be respected because there's some legal principle that's completely out of everybody's control, I think it's a question. It's a referendum question. It isn't a binding constitutional outcome. So first thing I would say, I think offends the democratic process, the court decision here. Second, I think it will mean that people start really, and there are politicians who are talking about going back and re-looking at question 35 in the Constitution, which is the area that the section of the Constitution that deals with Indigenous rights. And that's not necessarily a great conversation for us to be having in Canada at the moment. And I guess, and the third thing is that we haven't talked about is Quebec has a lot of, Quebec is traditionally the separatist province. I'm not sure Alberta, if there's an appeal, will be the only ones out there trying to figure out how to make sure that you can separate without having to consult First Nations. So I think this opens up a huge can of worms for everybody.
And Premier Smith mentioned that yesterday. We have another section. We'll continue this discussion because I think it's important, and also obviously pipeline politics and what that means, because these two issues are connected. Duty to consult on referendums and duty, or referenda, and duty to consult on a brand new pipeline, maybe to Prince Rupert. You can't just do it And obviously the judge said that yesterday. So we're going to come back in just a moment. Coming up, the federal and Alberta governments set to make that announcement tomorrow on that industrial carbon pricing. Could that MOU deal quell that separatist sentiment in Alberta? Our front bench panel is back after a short break. Stay with me. Welcome back to Power Play. I'm Graham Richardson in for Vashi. Let's get back to that announcement expected tomorrow between Ottawa and Alberta on the industrial price of carbon, a critical piece of the puzzle to get the pipeline to the West Coast built, or new one. Let's bring back the front bench, Christy Clark, Randy Boissonneaux, James Moore, and Alison Redford. Alison, I want to go to you. How much work remains here? This looks like an agreement between two governments. I keep hearing that that's just a small piece of it. Would you agree?
Well, I think it is. I think it's an important part. It's a signal. I think we've seen really good leadership from the federal government on this. Times change a lot over years. I think that everything that might be done in terms of it being a political agreement now really has to be, put in place with private sector corporate interests. And I think there's a reflection and a desire within, the industry to make sure that leadership is being demonstrated by government, and that then they're going to be able to continue to impact that sort of agreement, so that we see, the ability to keep exporting and building the economy. So I think that's important. Without that, I think that we do end up stalling. And so showing that leadership, I think, tomorrow is an important part of the process. No doubt, before these sorts of agreements are made, industry, of course, has been consulted. So I think we'll see a variety of discussions or comments from industry, but I think it's a good step.
Randy, you mentioned that, the Trudeau government expanded TMX. Fair. You bought it because nobody wanted it. What about capital here? Your government took a lot of lumps, continues to take a lot of lumps, the previous government, for chasing capital away. Has that been fixed?
So I think that's part of what this Memorandum of Understanding is. And Graham, let's break it down. What we're talking about here is Prime Minister Carney doing his level best as an Albertan to work with the government of Alberta to improve on the work that we did in government, and to make sure that there's a new deal between Alberta and the federal government. And it's not a menu, right? Like, there has to be the climate change
or
work
to change.
There has to be
Sorry to
change. That gets it could change, but there's also, and look, I've spent the last 7 of 10 weeks on the road in Japan and France and Latin America. People want to do work with Canada, and everywhere I went, people were talking about Canada being the energy superpower. Prime Minister Carney's catchphrase for the country. And where's that going to come from? Primarily from Alberta. That's why we need the new pipe to the coast. And what's interesting about this, if you take a look at TMX, we got a lot of lumps for it. It was $30 billion. It's making the country $5 billion a year. And eventually, that's going to be net positive to the whole country. And why does all of this matter? Because the Memorandum of Understanding is an example of the federal government and the provincial government getting along and making Albertans more prosperous and the country stronger. And the way that it links back, as you said in your intro, the way that it links back to the separation question is if somebody's at home watching this and they're like, look, I might just give the separation thing because I want a better shake, I want a better future for my kids, I want to see my family make more money. The best place for Alberta long-term is in Canada. And Graham, we got a hostile Russia, hostile China. The United States has shown us their hands. We cannot fight external threats if we are fighting ourselves internally. And that's why I think this new deal between Alberta and the federal government is going to require pathways. It's going to require other corporate actors to come to the table. And that's how we can show to people who are wondering, does Canada work? I think the proof will be in the pudding with this deal.
Christy Clark, and then James. I am reminded of the different view of pipelines from BC than Alberta. They are not the same. And I remind people in Ontario, what if we put a pipeline through Muskoka that was carrying someone else's oil? You probably have something to say about that. Tell me.
Fundamentally,
go ahead.
British Columbia differs from Alberta in the pipeline debate because in British Columbia there are over 100 First Nations, and most of them are untreated, and it requires, under Section 35 of the Constitution, a consultation. And it took Alberta, the Alberta industry, some time to kind of figure that out. But my government, we got an LNG pipeline through, we got LNG plants done, we landed the single largest private sector investment in Canadian history with LNG Canada. So glad to see our Premier finishing his path on the road to Damascus and supporting it in British Columbia now in the second phase. But look, British Columbians support resource development. It's just more complicated, and it's different from what happens in Alberta. So I think what I would say about the pipeline is, first of all, it's not going to Prince Rupert. There's too much controversy going on that route. It will go, I predict down as a doubling down the most of the TMX pipeline pathway now. That's great. It's fantastic for Canada. I will just finish by saying Canada remains still a very place to do business. And the time that it takes for permits to be given, for decisions to be made, all of the things that happened in the last decade federally that made it necessary for Canadians to spend billions of dollars buying a private sector pipeline for more than it was actually worth at the time. That shouldn't happen anymore, but it still is. We still have work to do to attract the investment that we're going to need to do this.
Last word to James. Sorry, I'm short on time. All of us could go for a long time. James, how much damage will be repaired by tomorrow?
Yeah, look, Christy's right. Look, I was chatting with my wife last night. She said, what's the summary of these two news stories of this week? And I said, well, this week, the prospect of energy exports went up and the prospects of Alberta separation went down. So it's been a good week. However, there are still some challenges around this. One of the challenges that hasn't been mentioned, but David Eby made an important point today on behalf of British Columbians, which is, should the deal tomorrow include a lowering of the ceiling on the industrial carbon tax and a pushing back of the timeline, and that's beneficial to Alberta? That's great. But it also means that provinces like British Columbia and all other provinces are in competition with Alberta for investment dollars and for regulatory timelines that are beneficial to our provinces and our province of British Columbia. So I think what's the challenge that Prime Minister Carney is going to have is that the deal that he's carved out tomorrow for Alberta, it's great for Alberta, I imagine. Hopefully it'll mean good things for Alberta, but it does put other provinces at a disadvantage, and they're going to want the same deal that Alberta got. I'm in favor of that, but it's something that needs to be remarked on, and I'm glad that David Eby made that point today.